then combusting the fuel in a vehicle. And then the last term, which I'll focus on today, is activity or vehicle miles traveled. So just to emphasize the importance of vehicle miles traveled, you heard this story in the previous talk broadly for the US, and I will be telling the same story for Minnesota. Not surprisingly, the details differ, but the story is the same. VMT matters. So here's one way of illustrating this. This plot shows historic levels of VMT increasing over time, although it's flattened out recently, and that makes for an interesting action in trying to forecast what VMT will be in the future. So we were given 3 possible futures by the state agencies that we worked with. The lowest one, the first one, is no growth in VMT, so VMT holding flat. The second one up is medium growth, where it increases at roughly 1% per year. Now, the population growth is also about 1% per year, so that medium growth rate in blue represents essentially no growth in per capita VMT. And then the last line, the red one at the top, is the higher growth, which sort of returns to historic levels, or actually there have been times when historic levels are greater than that. And so that's slightly more than 2%. So you have roughly 1% population growth, and then also 1% per capita growth in annual VMT. So when we use that as an input to our model, the output to the model is, again, over time, this time looking at the light-duty vehicle, LDV, life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. And then we've also plotted up here our target, our 2015 target, and then our 2025 target. Included in these model runs that I'm showing right now are CAFE standards, so increasing the fuel economy of vehicles. We're changing vehicles here. And then also a low carbon fuel standard. So we're also changing the fuels. And then what this represents is the sensitivity of the VMT assumption, that is changes that would be influenced by land use. And the point of this slide is that there's a significant difference among those 3 lines. So what happens to VMT really matters. A second point of this slide is that it's only the lowest of the 3 lines that meet the targets that are reduced to the 2015 and 2025 target. So what that suggests to us is that if we, again, there's 3 legs on the stool, as you saw that metaphor used, vehicles, fuels, and VMT. What this suggests is that if we only address 2 of those 3 issues, then progress in those 2 areas risks being undone by backsliding in the 3rd area that we don't address. So our main conclusions here are 2. The first is that meeting our goals requires all 3 approaches. We have to include land use and VMT on the table, not just vehicles and fuels. And the second thing, a clear thing that came from our modeling, is that meeting our goals requires starting now. That's very clear. We have the 2015 target is coming up quite rapidly. If we delay for a few years, we are unlikely to meet that goal. And I would put actually as a corollary to number 2, it does require action now, but it also requires sustained action. So we're talking about changes that take place not just over a few years, but over many decades. And so whatever policies are put in place need to show benefit in the short term, but also in the medium term and long term. When we turn to the CAFE standards and look at what's happened historically, in times of crisis or public awareness, we see the CAFE standards are tightened down, and then you go through periods when nothing happens, when it stagnates. And then something will happen, and they're tightened down, followed by nothing happening. And so it would be wonderful to see in this arena change that is cemented in place not only for the short term or medium term, but also for the long term to keep giving back over the decades. Let me turn now and just make a few comments about other environmental impacts. Of course, greenhouse gas emissions are quite important. But there are several others that land use strategies can help to address, and I've listed some of them up here. Let me just mention one concern among these and a potential tension that can play out, which relates to air pollution. And that is, if we were to increase density significantly and yet not influence people's travel patterns very much, if people continue to drive the same amount but in a much more dense city, then we risk having worsening air pollution, because you're taking the same emissions or slightly reduced emissions and putting them into a smaller area, the pollution would get worse in that arena. So that suggests a couple things. One is that if we're going to increase density, we need to make sure we don't only increase density, but do all the other things that you've heard talked about to allow people who wish to drive less to drive less. Or when increasing density, we also need to continue to reduce emissions from vehicles to avoid this worsening of urban air pollution. So I've listed here at the bottom what people sometimes call the 3Ds, density design, that is good urban design at the urban scale and the neighborhood scale, and then also diversity or mixed land use, as you just heard. Sometimes people add a fourth term, which is transit, on the end of those 3Ds. And again, we need to do all of those, not just one or two. So this slide kind of represents a lot of the research that I conduct. I just, in closing, wanted to give you one example of a study that I've worked on trying to combine these different outcomes. This is for Vancouver, British Columbia, which is where I was before I came here to Minnesota. And it's also often held up as a good example of a well-planned urban area. Here I'm comparing 3 different environmental outcomes. On the left is walkability. So that is pedestrian friendliness, or the opposite of automobile dependency. The downtown Vancouver is kind of towards the upper left of the slide. The blue is water. And what you can see is that the downtown area and the inner suburbs are more walkable, and then you move towards the outer suburbs away from the dark red is downtown, and away from downtown is less walkable, which is what you'd expect. Then the next 2 pictures are 2 different air pollutants. The first one is nitrogen oxide, NO, and you can see the concentrations are relatively higher downtown and along major roadways. And then the last pollutant is ozone, which is not emitted from cars, but instead is formed from chemical reactions, and those chemical reactions take some time to occur, an hour or 2 or so, and so the high concentrations of ozone are not right where the emissions are, but instead are downwind of them, in this case in the eastern suburbs, and so that's exactly what you would expect, and that's what you'd see, is that the higher ozone concentrations are in the suburbs. This last map here on the bottom tries to combine these 3 upper maps by looking at where are the areas that do especially well for all 3 attributes, and those are shown in green, and then where are the areas that do especially poorly for all 3, and those are shown in red. And what you can see is that the green areas those are the desirable neighborhoods. That is not only because they do well in the attributes I'm looking at, but also from having lived there, I can tell you those are quite desirable places to live. Those are not immediately downtown, but are close to downtown. Those are the dense urban residential neighborhoods. Whereas in contrast, the red regions, which do especially poorly for all these attributes, tend to be located more in the distant suburbs. Now, I'll also mention one last thing that this analysis did not include, which is we only looked at air pollution in 2 dimensions, how it varies in space by latitude and longitude, and not in the 3rd dimension, how it varies with height. And if while downtown Vancouver has a significant number of high-rise buildings, there's good evidence that after a certain height, you're significantly removed from the ground level vehicle emissions after 5 or 10 stories or so. So I suspect if we were able to access that information about height of buildings, we would see that the high rises downtown represent another set of green area. That is, they have high walkability and low pollution because they're not in the distant suburbs, so they don't have the ozone, and they're removed enough in height from the vehicle emissions that they would not be experiencing the high pollution at the ground level. So downtown Vancouver may represent another green area not shown here. So with that, thanks very much for your attention. I've listed the website here for our study. There's a report that is publicly available, and there's also a summary for policymakers for anybody who's interested. And in addition, as a shorter website is my own personal website, which has a link to our study as well. So thanks. I'm happy to take questions. No questions.
No, not yet.
Yeah, we'll have questions afterwards.
Good afternoon, and I will dispense with the engineer jokes, which I'm sure you've all heard before. Thank you very much. Here, let's pop the slide. No notes. Look at that. Sorry, this is a new version of PowerPoint to me. Which is the presentation?
You know, it should be up here. Your presentation is to go right there. So hit forward, you'll be fine. That's what's showing right now.
Oh, I see. I understand. Okay, thanks. Have you guys all seen the Lincoln Gettysburg PowerPoint. So he mounts the podium at Gettysburg. Is this thing on? You know, it really.